Hello, everyone. This is Tom Fox. I'm the Compliance Evangelist, and I'd like to welcome you to This Week in FCPA. First, a word from our sponsor, Affiliated Monitors. Founded in 2004, Affiliated Monitors provides professional, independent integrity monitoring and ethics and compliance assessments nationally and internationally and across almost all industries. With its knowledge of effective ethics and compliance programs and cultures, Affiliated Monitor is respected for its work as the corporate monitor on matters ranging from multinational corporations to small and mid-sized companies and even individuals. Having served in over 750 monitorships, no one has more experience as an independent monitor than the team at Affiliated Monitors. For more information on how an independent monitor can help improve your company's ethics and compliance program, visit our sponsor, Affiliated Monitors, at www.affiliatedmonitors.com. In this episode of This Week in FCPA, we take a look at the DOJ's new guidelines for the determination of an inability of a company to pay a fine or penalty. We take a bit of a deep dive into the NBA and its imbroglio around China, the issues of free speech, the ability to express oneself, and of course the Chinese hysteria over Hong Kong. Named in an FCPA investigation, well, if the company gets it wrong, there's no defamation case for you if you are a employee. The SEC calculation and length of time to award whistleblower awards comes under scrutiny. We take a look at that. What is the intersection of compliance and technology? Well, it turns out it's all about culture, which leads into our next article. We discuss what is the Chief Compliance Officer's role in corporate culture. There's a new interest group theory of anti-corruption enforcement and the extension of Caremark duties to boards. We preview a new 5-part podcast series that comes out next week, where Jay joins me to take a look at corporate culture. We discuss the upcoming baseball playoffs, but Jay, of course, tries to make it about the Patriots. All on This Week in FCPA. Hello, everyone. This is Tom Fox, the Compliance Evangelist and the voice of compliance, back with Jay Rosen, Mr. Monitor, for This Week in FCPA, episode 175 for the week ending October 11th, 2019, the NBA Steps in It edition. Jay, you probably saw that the Astros' inexorable march towards the World Series took 2 missteps, but that's okay. We're in Houston for Game 5 tonight. Garrett Cole's on the mound. The NBA seems to have them self-induced imbroglio that the president has now inserted himself in. But we had a lot of compliance and ethics stories this week. So you want to wave to your fans and then hit it?
Yeah. Hey, everyone. Let's go to this, and we'll circle up at the end with the NBA. This comes to us from our good friend Matt Kelly. And who is he, Tom?
The coolest guy in compliance.
The coolest guy in compliance. Matt writes in his blog, Radical Compliance, about new guidance on the inability to pay penalties. The Justice Department has published fresh guidance about how it will evaluate a company's claims that it can't afford to pay monetary penalties. Assistant Attorney General Brian Benskowski announced the new guidance Tuesday while giving a speech in New York. Quote, where legitimate questions exist regarding a company's inability to pay, the government will consider a range of factors, he said. The factors include the company's ability to raise capital, the circumstances giving rise to the organization's current financial condition, significant likely collateral consequences of the fine or penalty to the company, and whether the proposed fine or penalty will impair the ability to pay restitution. The memo to prosecutors includes an 11-point laundry list of financial data that companies will be expected to supply. One crucial point per Benskowski's memo is that inability to pay claims will only be considered after the company and prosecutors agree on the settlement of the case. Moreover, this guidance is useful. The U.S. sentencing guidelines do address the subject of inability to pay in sections 8C 2.2 and 8C 3.3, but those sections mostly talk about the court going below recommended penalties or guidelines. So ultimately, The sentencing guidelines do make clear that a penalty should not be so large that it endangers the company's ability to pay. Benskowski stressed that point again in his speech on Tuesday. So in other words, a penalty should only be reduced by the minimum amount necessary to give restitution to victims and to keep companies viable. Any thoughts on your part, Tom?
So you're right, Jay. This actually is not a new concept. I have seen this at play. We have seen this at play in other enforcement actions. But I think this really just kind of standardizes the rules. And one of the things it seems like Brian Benskowski is attempting to do is have a little more transparency so that everyone knows what the rules are kind of going forward. Nothing really new here, but I think certainly welcome for everyone to understand this is the roadmap if you have that issue going forward.
All right. Next up, we have a story from Haley Conniff in Law 360. It's entitled Ex-Biomed Employee Can't Sue Over FCPA Firing, says the Seventh Circuit. A former Biomed employee who was fired for his contacts with a corrupt distributor in Latin America can't sue his ex-employer for defamation, the Second Circuit ruled. They ruled on Tuesday, finding that Biomed listing him as a risk to the company's compliance with anti-bribery and anti-corruption laws does not constitute defamation. In 2002, you may remember that the Indiana-based medical device company entered a deferred prosecution agreement with the Department of Justice to resolve criminal and civil charges the company violated the FCPA. Per the agreement, Zimmer Biomed Holdings later distributed a list of individuals who posed a risk to the company's compliance with anti-corruption and anti-bribery laws. The former employee, Alejandro Yates, who was employed by the company's Argentina subsidiary and terminated in 2015, made the list because of his ties to a distributor who had bribed doctors. In a company statement, Yates was suspended in connection with the corruption investigation and said that none of the facts Yates attempts to raise are disputed, and whether he actually engaged in misconduct would disprove the facts of his suspension, the panel said, and as such, the statement is not actionable. During a DOJ investigation into the company's dealings in Latin America and Chinese doctors, federal investigators looked into Yates' communications with the distributor but didn't interview him according to a suit. All of his interactions with the distributor were approved by a legal department, he claimed, but was ultimately terminated. And recently, back in 2017, the DOJ concluded a second investigation finding that Biomed hadn't complied with the terms of its 2012 agreement and hitting the company with more penalties of another $30 million. The company then entered a second deferred prosecution agreement that referenced several instances of Yates' conduct according to the suit. So we've got another recidivist and an ex-employee not getting any love with what the company said about him.
So, Jay, if I could just say there was a case out of Texas a couple of years ago called Whitty versus Shell, and it was decided by the Texas Supreme Court. And the Texas Supreme Court held there was a qualified privilege that companies had when they engaged in an internal investigation and turned that report over to the government, so that Mr. Whitty claimed he was liable and defamed because it claimed he'd engaged in bribery and corruption. He said he had not, and he said that publication to the Department of Justice was enough to give him an action. The Texas Supreme Court said, no, you don't. So now we've had two employees who have tried to sue, claiming that they had some sort of a right or rather some sort of injury because of an internal investigation. Jay, if I could tie this to one of the other articles that we're going to talk about today, and that's an article in the Harvard Law School Forum on Corporate Governance and Financial Regulations entitled The Reverse Agency Problem in the Age of Compliance. And it's by two professors, one who's Asaf Eckstein, and the other I won't even try to pronounce his last name. But they really go through and talk about a couple of points I think were unrelated in the article, yet they tied them together. One was that companies can put a very large amount of pressure on employees to make statements that implicate others, with those others really having no protections against those statements. And he pointed to the famous KPMG case in 2003. But the real point of the article was that when statements are made implicating others, most specifically boards of directors, the board's officers and board members really have no recourse, and that the company will settle the case without referring to them and without taking their views into consideration. And they believe that does not provide officers and directors the opportunity or means to prove their innocence or even clear their name, since they don't even have a voice in this. So kind of an interesting, I don't want to say critique, but, I should say, I don't want to say complaint, but perhaps critique of those who are named in an investigation. And if you are named, you may be stuck with that, as we found with Mr. Yates, and also up to and including the board of directors, as the Harvard Law School Forum on Corporate Governance and Financial Regulation articles suggested.
So, Tom, next up, there's an article that seems to be timely, talking about a new way to calculate SEC whistleblower awards. Can you tell us about that?
Sure. I think people are becoming more frustrated, Jay, on perhaps not the amount of the awards, but the length of time it's taken. I think we've had one at 5 years now, and that just seems like an inordinately lengthy amount of time. There is a Senate piece of legislation, not House but Senate, which requires an award within a year. But this article by Amanda Rose really talks about more than the timing of the award, the quantum of the award, or the amount of the award. And she proposes that the amounts be more closely tied to the value of all penalties imposed rather than simply monetary penalties collected. So that could be interest, it could be profit disgorgement, reimbursement, a wide variety of other awards. So the SEC is really kind of getting critiqued, both in the length of time it takes to obtain a whistleblower award and the amount that are set. So she is a law school professor, I think, at Vanderbilt. So it's interesting that we've got this. We have a House piece of legislation to deal with digital realty trust. We have a Senate piece of legislation. The Senate piece of legislation speaks to the speed of the decision by the Securities and Exchange Commission. But here, Amanda Rose, or Professor Rose, takes a look at the quantum and suggests that there are really some specific amounts that or percentages that should be given based upon her analysis. So I think the discussion around whistleblower awards will certainly continue. There are several very well-known and prominent whistleblower-based plaintiffs' law firms that handle these cases, and they are typically ex-SEC officials who understand the kind of ins and outs and know these. But I think both of these questions, both the timing, the length of time to get an award, and the lack of transparency on the quantum issue are things that people would like to see a little more clarity from.
So next up, we have an article from a good friend of the podcast, Mike Volkov. He writes in his Corruption, Crime, and Compliance blog. And this week, Mike's looking at technology and compliance and asking, is there a magic bullet at the intersection? And Mike starts off with 3 quick quotes that I'll read for you. It has become appallingly obvious that our technology has exceeded our humanity, Albert Einstein. The human spirit must prevail over technology, Einstein again. And finally, technology is nothing. What's important is that you have faith in people and that they're basically good and smart. And if you give them tools, they'll do wonderful things with them. And that's Steve Jobs. So Mike says that we're now living in an era of rapid technological advancement, and even in some small ways, this affects ethics and compliance. We start with the simple transition from a paper compliance program to an operationalized program that increasingly depends on the effectiveness of automated solutions. The compliance profession is increasingly relying on automated solutions and the impact it's having on compliance. A recent Snavix global report identified the two most significant predictors in compliance success are senior managers' buy-in and support and automation. At a recent CAMS meeting in Las Vegas, Mike was struck by the language surrounding each and every vendor in the exhibit hall that talked about the company's machine learning and artificial intelligence. Mike predicts that the compliance industry is quickly integrating into a simple compliance platform or dashboard, which consists of the following critical functions: incident data, employee concerns, conflict of interest, culture monitoring, third-party risk management, training, and polishing management. No matter how you define ethics and compliance or even get into the question of whether a corporation is a person, the ultimate issue is that a company's most important asset is people, meaning the board, senior management, and employees. So you can have all the tech, but if you don't have the right people making the decisions, it really won't amount to a hill of beans.
So, yeah, Jay, I'm continually sort of amused by this critique and commentary that, you've got to have a lawyer in, you have to have oversight over the tech. That's been true since the abacus. I mean, it certainly was true in the slide rule. To prove the point are Mike's quotes from Albert Einstein. He delivered them in the early part of the 20th century. So there seems to be a fear, particularly lawyers in the compliance space of technology. They're afraid that it's going to supplant them in some way. I mean, that's just horse hockey. And Steve Jobs and Mike Volkov are absolutely right. It's a tool. Any tech is a tool. AI is a tool. Smart learning is a tool. And there's just there's no substitute for the human interaction with a tool. I mean, maybe Skynet will become self-aware in our lifetime. And when it does, perhaps we won't be having this conversation because we'll all be subject to Skynet's social media oversight. But right now, there's always going to be the human element in play. So I don't know if Skynet's closer to you over in California or not, but if it's about to become self-aware, please let us know here in Texas.
We'll give you a heads up if it happens. So what's next on the hot 10 of compliance?
So we had a new case out of the Delaware Chancery Court that really talked about the duties of a board of directors in a compliance program. And it's from my U of M law school colleague, Kevin LaCroix, although not the same class year, definitely a fellow U of M law grad. And his always excellent D&O diary, he takes a look at a case that came out on October 1, Clovis Oncology. It follows a case earlier this year called Marchand. And Marchand established that corporation must have oversight over a compliance program, but Clovis Oncology took it a step further and said, not only do you have to have oversight, you have to engage in oversight. So slowly but surely, the Caremark duties around compliance are expanding, and simply having a compliance program, having a monitoring system in place is not going to be enough if it all goes down the tubes and the board of directors are sued. I mean, Kevin's angle, of course, is directors and officers liability insurance, so he really has his finger on the pulse of litigation, where it's civil litigation, where there was money involved. And Clovis Oncology had a potential drug in development called Roki, and Roki was intended to treat a type of lung cancer. And the issue a specific issue in this case was whether or not the board of directors had oversight into the clinical tests that were being done. And what the court said was, if whatever the highest risk to you is, That's what you need to monitor. And I know that's going to be familiar to you, Jay, and anyone else listening to this podcast, because that's a risk-based analysis. Well, for this startup drug company, the one and only product they had was this lung cancer drug. So that was the highest risk. It's also the highest business opportunity. But it said that the court said that the board, they had oversight, but they never exercised that oversight. So board of directors, wake up. You need to start overseeing your corporate compliance program. You need to start overseeing your data protection program. You need to start overseeing your data privacy program. There's a wide variety of things you need to actually engage in oversight on. And that means you need compliance expertise on the board for these types of issues. So just another step forward in the Caremark duties case, but it's once again focused on the requirements of the board of directors to actively engage in oversight of a compliance program, Jay.
Interesting stuff, Tom. This week, I wanted to share with you that I continued my current 5-part series on corporate compliance insight. And this week, I took a look at who bears the responsibility for culture and what is the extent that the chief compliance officer should be involved in shaping a culture of ethics and driving ethical behavior. It all begins with the response to a simple question: who is responsible for culture in an organization? Within the C-suite level, you may get several responses: the CEO, the head of HR, or perhaps even the general counsel. But the duty most often falls to the chief compliance officer, meaning the CCO and the entire compliance function need to be able to coordinate the various inputs and support mechanisms that guide employee behavior. It's important for the CCO to be proactive in the role of shaping culture. The CCO should work to eliminate barriers to aid in driving business success rather than being perceived as the Department of No. The CCO can work to coordinate all the activities relating to building a culture in an organization. When managing upward, CCOs have an equally critical role. It's a clear best practice for the CCO to have unfettered access to and provide information to the board regarding compliance and ethics. So what are the warning signs of an unethical culture? They can be a wide variety of behaviors and actions, things like disrespectful attitudes, favoritism or nepotism in promotions, a large number of anonymous whistleblowers. These are all the kinds of things that a CCO needs to be on top of. And it's up to the CCO to understand and have his or her finger on what culture is, where the challenges lie, and what needs to be done to continually strengthen the culture. So next week, please join me and we'll take a look at how a company can begin to assess its own culture.
Jay, there was another article in the Harvard Law School Forum on Corporate Governance, references a law review article entitled "Toward an Interest Group Theory of Foreign Anti-Corruption Laws." And it's really almost legal philosophy because the authors, Sean Griffin and Tom Lee, they posit or they discuss rather why countries would enforce anti-corruption laws against companies not domiciled in their home countries. And of course, that's one of the largest impacts of FCPA enforcement is non-U.S. based companies. I think at the last count, 8 of the top 10 awards, FCPA awards, were non-U.S. based companies. And so they really take a look at this and they come up with something they call the interest group theory. And the interest group theory says it's not the country that has the interest in enforcing anti-corruption laws, but actually business groups. And the business groups have that interest because they believe that enforcement of such laws levels the playing field. Obviously, the FCPA was the first such law passed in 1977, but it was really the business lobby which achieved moving these laws out to other countries through the OECD convention and other treaties. Obviously, we have a wide number, indeed a plethora of countries with anti-corruption laws now, looking no doubt to get on the enforcement gravy train of fines and penalties. But kind of an interesting way to think about not only how laws come into be enacted, but how they are enforced and the different pressures that are put on organizations or rather the different pressures organizations can put on governments really to help facilitate business on a worldwide basis.
So, Tom, I know in the open we talked a little bit about the Houston Astros and their impending march to the World Series, but the Astros were not Houston's only team in the news this week. Could you tell us about Daryl Morey and how Adam Silver reacted to his tweet?
Talk about a tempest starting in a teapot and literally exploding in an unexpected way, no doubt for Daryl Morey. Daryl Morey sent out a tweet that said basically going beyond simply stay strong Alabama in the face of a non-hurricane. He said that stand strong with the protesters in Hong Kong. And this set off a blank storm across China. The Chinese government went bonkers over this. They are extraordinarily sensitive about Hong Kong. Hong Kong is theirs. Let's repeat. The British gave it to them 20 years ago. Anyone who's followed the news in Hong Kong should not be surprised at all that here 20 years later, the Chinese are trying to do what they're doing in Hong Kong, but Hong Kong is theirs. It's not the British. So anyway, they're very, very sensitive about this. They basically told Houston to fire Daryl Morey or else. They told the NBA to fire Daryl Morey or else. Fortunately, Tillman Fertitta, the owner of the Houston Rockets, recognizing that Morey is, if not the best, one of the best GMs in basketball, if not all of sports, did not fire him. He did chastise him, though. He said he didn't speak for the Houston Rockets, and I'm sure he had a meeting at the took him to the shed, as they would say, for a few choice words. Adam Silver originally gave a statement that seemed completely subservient and obsessed to the Chinese. And then the next day, Adam Silver came back and said, free speech is one of our core values, and we're going to stand up with people who stand up for free speech. So Adam Silver stood up a little bit. The president attacked Steve Kerr, and who's the coach of the Spurs, and Greg Popovich, the head of Steve Kerr, is the head of the Warriors. Greg Popovich is the head of the San Antonio Spurs, the coach, for not attacking the Chinese. Of course, Trump has not said one boo word about the Hong Kong protesters, and indeed has told the Chinese he won't do that because he wants a trade deal. So typical hypocrisy from the president. Nevertheless, we have this entire storm now, and the Chinese cut off basketball televised rights to the Houston Rockets. The Houston Rockets had minor league teams that were going to play in China. They were prevented from playing in China. There was a game last night. I think it was the Nets and Lakers that was allowed to proceed, but it was not televised. The signage went down around the NBA. The Chinese are very upset about this. And it really points up a very difficult set of problems, choices, and actions every company must make if they're doing business in a country like China. If you mention Taiwan, that is verboten in China. And it may get to be that mentioning Hong Kong is verboten. The NBA, of course, prides itself as being the leading sports league around social issues and social justice. So the irony of Donald Trump calling out Greg Popovich and Steve Kerr for not calling out the Chinese is not lost on anyone who follows sports. But it's just a huge storm. And Nike is going to get dragged into this now. I think Nike had $116 billion market cap, much higher than the NBA. A lot of shoes to be sold in China, a lot of products to be sold in China. So everyone, I think, is understanding that they have to watch everything they say and have to think about it. Today, my trainer and I were talking about this, and he said, Maury's one of the smartest guys. He should have known. I'm like, he is a smart guy. He's a quant, though. He's not a qualitative guy. And it'd be like me, trying to opine on the vicissitudes of E equal MC squared. He had no idea what he was getting himself into. And I'm sure he's sorry that he did, but he did. And what the NBA does going forward, I think is going to be very telling for a lot of American businesses.
Good stuff, Tom. Next week, what do we have on tap for your weekly podcast view or your daily podcast viewers?
So, yeah, Jay, very excited. You previewed it a little bit without previewing it when you talked about your article on CCI this week on the Chief Compliance Officer's role in culture. Well, next week, we've got a 5-part podcast series, myself and Jay, but if you listen, it's mainly Jay, in a series sponsored by Affiliated Monitors on exploring ethical culture in a corporation. We have a 5-part series. We look at what is ethical culture, how do you influence ethical culture, what are the factors of ethical culture, what's the role of the CCO, how do you assess ethical cultures, and what's the role of ethical culture in an overall ethics and compliance program. It's a really interesting series. Kudos to you, Jay, for kind of doing the legwork on this to put it together. It was a lot of fun for me to produce it with you. Each episode will go up on Monday through Friday on the FCPA Compliance Report and JD Supra. It will post to YouTube on Saturday, the 12th. It will binge drop on iTunes at midnight on Monday the 14th, I believe. So if you want to line them all up and listen to them, they'll be available for listening. We link to Jay's articles in each one of these posts if they're available, and it's a great series. And I'm really coming around to thinking, Jay, that it used to be location, then it became document, but it may be culture going forward.
Well, we'll see if we can make that bold statement after next week. So, anything else from the sports world?
Well, we're recording this before the Astros beat Tampa Bay tonight and start our inexorable next step in playing the New York Yankees in the ALCS, which will start in Houston on Friday night. The Astros will be in Houston on Friday, win or lose tonight, so I'm pretty confident in that statement. Because if they win, they'll be playing. If they lose, they'll be at home. So looking forward to the game tonight, looking forward to some great baseball and great football this weekend with Mrs. Compliance Evangelist.
And I guess I will look forward to some football. I can't, describe it as being great or lacking, but the New England Patriots, without Antonio Brown, are playing the New York Football Giants. So we'll see how that goes. But
Danny Dimes.
On behalf of Tom Fox, the compliance evangelist, and myself, Jay Rosen, Mr. Monitor, I'd like to thank you for joining us for This Week in FCPA, episode 175 for the week ending October 11th. The NBA steps in an edition. Enjoy the Astros, enjoy football, and if you're here in the U.S., enjoy the NBA. Thanks so much for joining us. Have a great weekend.
Hello, everyone. This is Tom Fox again. I'd like to thank you for listening to this episode of This Week in FCPA. If you have any questions, you can email Jay at jrosen at affiliatedmonitors.com. You can email me at tfox@tfoxlaw.com. I hope you will join Jay and I again next week, where we take a look at some of the week's top compliance and ethics stories which caught our eye. This Week in FCPA is a production of the Compliance Podcast Network and a proud member of C-Suite Radio. Thanks again for listening.